Welcome to the first meeting of the History of Photography Focus Group. There's a lot of dense information available to discuss with this topic. I don't want this to be only a lecture of events and dates, but instead highlight on how this history can affect us as photographers and see what we do more clearly and allow us to be more deliberate in our work. With this presentation, I want to cover where cameras came from and when photography became a fine art. I will be focusing on historical events, places, and people to bring across a specific point. Please keep in mind that this information is not all inclusive. There are organizations and nationalities involved that played a part in this history, but I'm trying to keep this simple. I certainly hope that I'm not blindly ignoring information. The camera obscura is the simplest kind of camera, and it's not much different from the cameras we use now. In the 17th century, French mathematician Pierre de Fermat was credited for the discovery that light traveled in straight lines. This is called the rectilinear propagation of light, and this is how images come into our cameras. The first written account of a camera obscura was by Chinese philosopher Mo Su in 500 BC. It's hard to say when the camera obscura process was first observed, but during the beginning and end of a solar eclipse, unmistakable crescent shapes are visible amongst the shadows of tree leaves. I'm sure this phenomenon was seen deep into prehistoric times, but it's impossible to tell when those crescents were perceived as the silhouette of the moon, or maybe as big bites being taken out of the sun. If you think about it, the light filtering through the leaves on a sunny day are multiple projected images of the circular sun that bleed into one another. We just don't notice the circularity. Using a pinhole to project an image of an eclipsing sun is exactly the same thing that happens using a deliberately constructed camera obscura. Camera obscura is Latin for dark room or dark chamber. This illustration is accurate and shows a dark room, but it wouldn't be of that much use, at least in the situation depicted, since you only have one boring view forever. Camera obscuras in a fixed room like this are still popular in tourist spots with a lens pointing at historical landscapes. The most famous is in the Outlook Tower in Edinburgh, Scotland. Camera obscuras flip the image upside down and sideways, which is the same thing that happens in modern cameras. The smaller the hole, the sharper and dimmer the image, which still applies to today's cameras. Single lens reflex DSLRs and DSLRs flip the image so that it's oriented correctly by using a mirror and a device called a prism to correct the flip in the viewfinder. Mirrorless cameras have no mirrors or prisms, and the electronic viewfinders are flipped digitally. Leonardo was well aware of the camera obscura and wrote about it in 1490. He knew its potential, and many artists took advantage of the camera obscura in one way or another. Here is a portable dark chamber with an artist tracing the projected image. Notice the projection is upside down. The dark chamber would either be a wagon pulled by a horse or a collapsed structure transported on a wagon that could be assembled where it was needed. I can only imagine the difficulty trying to line up a shot by adjusting the position of this structure. Dutch poet Constantijn Huygens said this about the camera obscura in the 17th century. It is impossible to express the beauty of the camera obscura image in words. The art of painting is dead, for this is life itself, or something higher if we could only find a word for it. The 2013 documentary Tins Vermeer suggested that Johannes Vermeer cheated by tracing shapes using the camera obscura process. Of course, art is a million times more complicated than simply tracing an image, and I will leave the artistically challenged folks to conclude that Vermeer wasn't really an artist. I would like to learn more about how he used a camera obscura, but it might have been as simple as mounting a lens on a vertical rod, then positioning the projection onto a piece of paper or canvas. In Vermeer's time, camera obscuras were starting to be placed in boxes with the lens instead of a pinhole to control the image. By the time 1816 rolled around, Joseph Nicephore Niepce was trying to arrive at a Xerox copy kind of process to duplicate artwork using light-sensitive materials. He didn't have much success in making usable copies, but after 10 years it occurs to him to capture a live scene using a camera obscura. Niepce coated a thin layer of bitumen of Judea on a pewter plate that would harden as it was exposed to light. Once he placed this plate into the back of a camera obscura, the areas that were exposed to the most light hardened, and the areas that weren't as exposed were not hardened. I've read reports of the exposure time being as short as 8 hours, and other reports of it being as long as 2 days. Once the exposure was completed, Niepce used acid to wash away the soft bitumen of Judea. The result was the first ever photograph. The name of this photo is View from the Windows at Le Gras. It currently resides in the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin. Niepce never called this a photograph because that word didn't exist until after his death. He called it a heliograph, meaning sun drawing or sun writing. The word photograph is coined by British scientist Sir John Herschel to mean light drawing or light painting. The modern-day camera evolved from the camera obscura with progressive technological improvements of 3 basic ingredients: camera and lens, film or a digital sensor, and a shutter. Lenses have been around for some time with telescopes and other devices, but manufacturing processes continue to improve. Often a photographer would simply remove then replace the lens cap instead of using a shutter. In the last part of the 19th century, shutters worked vertically and powered by a rubber band or spring with a gravity assist. The next step were shutters moving horizontally with a spring, then a variety of rotating, hemispheric, diaphragm, leaf focal spring, and then, finally, electronic shutters. Starting with Niepce's multiple-day exposure to Doc Edgerton's 1/4 millionth of a second, shutters have come a long way. Film sensitivity is the most finicky variable. Chemistry and the diligence of scientists and engineers struggled throughout most of the 19th century and through most of the 20th century to improve the light sensitivity characteristics of glass plates and film. Finally, digital sensors were refined to the point of surpassing the quality of anything that could be arrived at through chemistry. Louis Daguerre was the first photography pioneer to employ commercially successful processes. While the quality of daguerreotypes was exponentially better than Niepce's 8 hours or day-long exposures, they still required 3 minutes or longer to create a photo. Many of these photos were very deliberate and used for serious record keeping. William Henry Harrison was the first president to be photographed in 1841 as a daguerreotype. In 1851, Frederick Scott Archer developed the collodion process that allowed for photos to be created using 2 or 3 second exposures. The collodion process blew the doors wide open to more ambitious photographic endeavors, and a significant increase in the number of photographs were made that people in the 19th century were keen to see. The first ever photography exhibit was in London at the Victor and Albert Museum in 1858. It was organized by the Photography Society of London along with its counterpart in France. Shortly after, Queen Victoria sponsored the Photographic Society of London, making it a royal entity. It was renamed as the Royal Photographic Society, which is still very much in business. This photograph is the first photograph of a photography exhibit. In 1876, chemists Ferdinand Herder and Charles Driffield developed the science of sensitometry and how light-sensitive surfaces behave, and this science is still valid, at least for film. Around 1940, Ansel Adams and Fred Archer developed their famous zone system as a technique that allows everyday photographers to use the principles of sensitometry. Much of the way their zone system is used can still be applied to digital images, even though we no longer think of the density of images on film. Keep in mind that the practice of photography is done by scientists or keen experimentalists. Most people never thought of it as an art, but more as just a way to record something. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the name George Eastman. I often think of him rolling in his grave on how his company dropped the ball when digital photography came to prominence. In 1881, Eastman developed, perfected, and patented manufacturing processes for applying light-sensitive material to glass plates known as dry plates. Previously, wet plates were the norm that had to be coated shortly before the exposure, exposed, and developed shortly after exposure. His dry plate process allowed the long-term storage of plates before and after exposure, which was a huge advantage over wet plates. In 1885, he developed roll film that could hold multiple exposures with all the advantages of the dry plate. His roll film was pretty much the standard of film usage until the advent of digital photography. In 1888, Eastman patented the first roll film camera, the Kodak No. 1. A roll film could contain 100 round images. Round because the corners of the image had noticeably low quality. It cost $25, which is $600 in today's money. When all 100 shots were exposed, the camera was sent back to the factory where the film was removed and processed. The camera was then returned with a fresh roll of film and the prints from the previous roll. Eastman had an ingenious marketing campaign with the slogan, "You press a button, we do the rest." He sold 1.5 million cameras in 10 years to earn $37.5 million, or $1.1 billion in today's money. I would learn about the cost of sending the camera back. Maybe it was $25 for each reload. Going back to the London Photographic Society, many photographers were beginning to feel that art was just as important and maybe more important than the science involved in photography. In 1892, a group of them led by Henry Peach Robinson and George Davison seceded from the London Photographic Society to form the Brotherhood of the Linked Ring, or simply the Linked Ring. The three rings in the logo stand for good, true, beautiful, which is a Masonic or Catholic concept, but certainly applies to photography. The Link Ring was interested in pictorialism, with an emphasis on creating photographs that looked like or had the same aesthetic value as a fine art painting. You can't blame them for scoffing at photos that lacked long agreed upon compositional artistic principles. However, I don't believe they knew what was going to happen as the science of photography progressed to create finer and finer images. And possibly the goal of creating a photograph that looked like a painting was more about painting than not photography. Regardless, many pictorialist photos from that time are extraordinarily beautiful, and I believe pictorialism has a valid place in the art of photography today. Eastman Kodak introduced the new Brownie box camera in 1900 for $1 and was supported by a major advertising campaign. The name Brownie was chosen primarily because of the popularity of a children's book of cartoons of the same name, and partly because the camera was initially manufactured for Eastman by Frank Brownwell of Rochester, New York. It used Kodak No. 117 roll film that would hold 6 square 6 by 6 centimeter images, which is the same size provided by the classic Hasselblad 500 CM. Kodak No. 117 film was available until 1949. This greatly increased the interest in photography, especially since the Brownie only cost $1. Inspired by the Link Ring and its secession from the Royal Photographic Society, a group of U.S. East Coast photographers led by Edward Steichen and Alfred Stieglitz broke away from the Camera Club of New York. Stieglitz called this the Photo Secession. Like the Linked Ring, the Photo Secession was mainly interested in pictorialism. In those days, pictorialism included good composition and often soft focus was applied. Manipulation of the finished prints by adding colors, text, or drawings was common. The emphasis was to make a photo look like a painting. The poster in this slide is an example of a photograph that was heavily manipulated to add illustrative text and colors. Or maybe this is an illustration that utilizes a photograph as one of the elements. Is a photograph an illustration or simply pictorialism? I believe that silhouetted figure is taken from a photograph of Alfred Stieglitz. As co-founder of the Photo Secession, Stieglitz embraced pictorialism, but his work tends to be less pictorialist than many of the other members of the Photo Secession. The photo in the upper left is called The Steerage. Shot in 1907 and printed a few years later, this is his most famous work and is practically photojournalism in its realism. His photo of Grand Central Station with the sunbeams practically burning their way through the print like some kind of Martian death ray imparted incredible mood, and while I'm sure some dodging and burning occurred, very little manipulation was used in this photo compared to what most of us do today. The modernism art music could be brought into this conversation with photos of Grand Central Station and the train, but I will leave that for another time. Alfred Stieglitz's efforts in creating and promoting printed material like magazines and books that contain photographs were significant and greatly increased the demand for photography's fine art and graphic arts in general. The other founder of the Photo Secession, Edward Steichen, was a champion of pictorialism, and the Steichen photos in this slide are considered to be exemplars of the genre. Soft focus and adding colors, like in the famous Flatiron building on the right, added a mood that was not present in the original negative. In the lacy photo of Gloria Swanson, it almost looks like the lace could have been sandwiched with the negative, but of course that would have resulted in white lace. The lace was actually placed in front of her face when the photo was taken. This was pure genius at work, and it did not require heavy manipulation while still imparting otherworldliness. The image that looks like a woman on fire is of Isadora Duncan, and it was shot at the Parthenon in Greece. While this looks totally manipulated after the fact, it's actually a result of a slow shutter speed with the wind pressing a dress against her body with the edges flapping. This is exactly the kind of balance between blurred motion and sharpness that I sometimes try to create but usually fail. It's not exactly intentional camera movement, but the principles are the same. With the photo secession, much of pictorialism was an anything-goes kind of thing that's as valid as any other artistic pursuit, but some heavy manipulations began to be less about photography than some photographers were comfortable with. With the ever-increasing quality of film and lenses, many photographers were more interested in exploring the potential of the exquisite graduated tones and sharpness that could be created instead of mimicking painting. Straight photography, often called pure photography, was less about manipulation after the photo was taken and more about taking advantage of what the medium had to offer, while also employing the fundamental concepts of artistic composition. In the strictest sense, a straight photograph was to be entirely unaltered from the original negative. The resulting product would be a contact print that is exactly the same size as the negative. No cropping was allowed. Pictorialism as a direct opposite of straight photography is one way to think about it, but why not borrow from both? Do we really want our photographs to look like paintings? Is it really a violation of purity to only create contact prints? As much as I admire all the photographers in Group F64 in the West Coast photographic movement, their manifestos saying, possessing no qualities of technique, composition, or idea derivative of any other art form, that is just silly. Are we not supposed to use the tools of composition that have been laid down for centuries just because another art form uses them? What about the concepts of lighting pioneered by the likes of Rembrandt and Vermeer? That would not be allowed. My guess is their manifesto was a knee-jerk and hyperbolic reaction to the photographers pretending to be painters who did not have the skill to paint themselves. There's no question the work of the pure photography folks are fine art and can stand toe-to-toe with current-day photographs. More often than not, this type of photography is what non-photographers think of as the pinnacle of the art. I lean towards straight photography myself. If someone says that one of my photos look like a painting, even if their intention is as a compliment, the first thing I think of is that I've overprocessed the image. However, that's just me. Both Steichen and Stiglitz embraced straight photography eventually. Stiglitz was more of a straight photographer than Steichen from the beginning. To me, some of Steichen's heavily manipulated pictorialism is over the top, like in this photo. However, his pictorialist in-camera works are lessons on how pictorialism and straight photography can be the same thing. Notice the Stiglitz quotes at the bottom of this photo. Personally, I like my photography straight, unmanipulated, devoid of all tricks, a print not looking like anything but a photograph, living through its own inherent qualities and revealing its own spirit. While I have a deep appreciation for pictorialism, I have not been able to determine when the tide turned against pictorialism with mainstream photographers after Group F64. Possibly the undeniable beauty of straight photography done by people who know what they're doing turned the tide. Photographers like Ansel Adams and Edward Weston got so much attention it must have been hard not to jump onto that bandwagon. Albert Stiglitz might actually have been the first person to promote straight photography even before the West Coast photography movement. And it was Ansel Adams who first abandoned the non-manipulation manifesto of the F64 group in favor of his extensive developing and darkroom techniques. It seems to me like with all other endeavors, there are instances where things can seem like a good idea at the time, especially when responding to the perceived missed opportunities of others. But then people change their minds. Ansel Adams was known to be so opposed to pictorialism that he wished death on his fellow California photographer William Mortensen, describing him as enemy number one and the Antichrist. I completely agree with the photo secessionist saying, what was significant about a photograph was not what was in front of the camera, but the manipulation of the image by the artist photographer to achieve his or her subjective vision. With the advent of digital RAW files, it's absurd not to alter them in post. That's how those files are supposed to work. It's entirely possible and not that hard to create pictorialist images without much processing. If you pay attention to the light composition and tones at the scene, to me, that's when the artistry comes in. However, if your idea of photography is adding things that aren't in the original file, that can be equally valid artistically, but maybe it's not 100% photography. I will say that if you go down that road, it might seem easy at first, but to do it right, you absolutely must know what you're doing. Now, where do you fit into this story?